Our next presentation will be from members of the Locke Foundation, Becky Gray and Jon Sanders. Another disclosure: for somewhat over a decade, I was on the board of the Locke Foundation, but I've been off for a while. Becky, welcome.
Thank you so much. Good morning, Senator Wells, members of the committee, staff, and guests. My name is Becky Gray. I'm Vice President for Outreach at the Locke Foundation. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you this morning. Now, I know the topic for today's meeting is occupational licensing, but I wanted to start with thanking you for the reforms you have put in place over the last 4 years, with comprehensive tax reform, accountability, and reforms that have improved education, with investments in long-term infrastructure needs, reducing the size and scope of government, and rolling back burdensome regulations. Our economy is getting back on its feet. State revenue is ahead of projections, GDP is up, unemployment is down, per capita income is growing, and 234,000 net new jobs have been created in North Carolina. Our state has become a model, not only in our region, but in the nation. But there's still a lot of work to be done. And until every North Carolinian has the opportunity to find a job, until every barrier to succeed is removed, until every unfair treatment is eliminated, until the freedom to choose is open to all, there's still work to be done. So I commend you for your leadership in taking a good hard look at North Carolina's occupational licensing laws and your willingness to make reforms to clean up a very messy system. As you know, North Carolina has one of the more restrictive occupational licensing systems in the country. North Carolina has 154 licensed job categories. South Carolina has 49. There are accountability and oversight problems. There are inconsistencies in requirements and inequities in cost to obtain a license. And quite frankly, some leave you scratching your head as to why they require a state license at all. And these restrictions ripple through our economy, preventing people from pursuing their dreams, driving up the cost of services, impacting individuals, families, communities, the state's economy, and whether businesses want to expand or grow here. These restrictions are particularly harmful for low-income North Carolinians. And who benefits? It's often those ingrained in a profession who have a self-interest in protecting what they perceive as their turf, keeping out competition, manipulating the market, and inflating costs for their financial and professional benefit. But it's also complicated. We want to open opportunity while ensuring that public health and safety are secure. So it's a balance between what is the appropriate government oversight and how free should the occupational market be. So as you would imagine, this is something that the Locke Foundation has taken a look at, and we've done quite a bit of studying of this issue. And so have others. You'll hear later this morning from our friends at the North Carolina Justice Center. There's a lot of research on occupational licensing. Your own Program Evaluation Division has looked at this extensively. The State Auditor's Office, the Institute for Justice, Council of State Governments, Mercatus Institute at George Mason University, the Goldwater Institute, the Upton Institute for Employment Research. Even the White House has done a study of this. And the findings are pretty consistent. When it's harder to enter a profession, there are fewer employment opportunities. Excluded workers earn lower wages, and costs are increased for consumers. Inconsistency within professions and variations across state lines create barriers for workers to move across state lines and inefficiencies for businesses, and it's a drag on the economy. The cost of licensing falls disproportionately on low-income workers. Well-designed and carefully implemented licensing requirements can benefit consumers while allowing qualified workers to freely pursue the occupation of their choice. And it's that last one, implementing a system that protects safety and protects the freedom to pursue one's dreams, that you have the ability to change and to make North Carolina a model in occupational licensing, just as North Carolina has become a model in other reforms that you have implemented. So I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, Jon Sanders, the Director of Regulatory Studies at the Locke Foundation, in just a minute. He's going to give you a lot of information. He's going to give you a lot of data, a lot of statistics, a lot of solid information that you can use to make good decisions. He's going to tell you what occupational licensing is. He's going to outline some of the problems. He's going to tell you what's happening in other states. He's going to tell you about the challenges. He's going to even tell you how to fix it. But while you're listening to Jon and all of this data, and as you review this data, I'd invite you to keep in mind why you should reform occupational licensing. And it's for the young man who wants to open a barber shop in his low-income neighborhood, who wants to instill pride in his community and access to a quality service at an affordable price. But with the requirement of 722 days of experience and training, becoming a barber is out of his reach. It's for the single mom with a deaf child who is proficient in sign language and struggling financially. She has the knowledge, she has the passion, and she knows firsthand what sign language does for the deaf. She wants to become a sign language interpreter here in North Carolina. But with the $923 licensing fee, it's just too steep for her, and it makes her dream of becoming a sign language interpreter out of her reach. It's for the handyman dad who wants the freedom and financial opportunity to open his own business, installing security alarm systems. But with the 1,095 days of training and experience required to obtain a license, the obligation of his current job, his current full-time job, and his family commitments, his dream of starting his own business is out of his reach. North Carolina's restrictive occupational licensing requirements create barriers for real people. They impede real people's choices, and they prevent real people from pursuing their dreams. Their freedom is at stake, and that's why reform is absolutely necessary. So I'm going to turn it over to Jon now for more information.
I want to thank the committee for having me. Thank the representatives and senators, and for everyone who's here. It's an honor to be here. If I can figure this out. Okay, that's one thing I haven't done wrong. Would like to mention, Becky talked about freedom, and I think that is the primary overarching concern here. I found it very instructive that North Carolina's Constitution recognizes in Article 1, Section 1, as self-evident, the right, the inalienable right of all people to life, liberty, but it includes the enjoyment of the fruits of their own labor and the pursuit of happiness. Those of you, I'm sure, recognize the language from the Declaration of Independence, except for the addition of the enjoyment of the fruits of their own labor. This is not in a Declaration of Independence for North Carolina. This is enshrined within our own state constitution. So what I see is that the state constitution recognizes an inalienable right to the enjoyment of the fruits of your own labor. Now, as we've discussed, and I really appreciated your presentation, Chuck, and the work that y'all have done. I think it's very important. An occupational license is a receipt of official permission from the government for someone to engage in the field, the chosen field of work that he or she wants to engage in. That comes at a cost. It comes at a cost of, yes, the licensure fee, comes at a cost of the time and the cost of tuition in pursuing an education, to log in the class hours, to log the job experience hours, such as with the barbers. It includes sitting fees for any exams. Some occupations require one exam, some require several. And of course it will include renewal fees. All of these are potential hurdles for pursuing an occupation, especially for those who have the least amount of resources. Now, I do a lot at Locke. I do a lot of reading the economic research literature. I go blind on that stuff so other people can do productive work. See, I throw in a joke like that and it's supposed to lighten the crowd up. Anyway, But the research literature finds that the employment grows faster when the hurdles of licensure are not in place. There are many, many occupations that will be licensed in one state that aren't licensed in another. In the states where that occupation is not licensed, employment grows at a much faster clip. The research done, I believe this was from Morris Kleiner out at the University of Minnesota, shows it about 20% faster than it does in areas in states where the occupation is subject to licensure. Licensing keeps the supply of labor in the regulated field from growing as fast as it otherwise would go. Now, those who are familiar with economics understands what happens when you have a limited supply, what happens to prices. When you raise the cost of getting into an activity, it also has these effects. Licensure costs are very large hurdles for the poor. It's a large hurdle for those who are less educated, who are uncomfortable with the school situation, with sitting in a classroom. It tends to be a large hurdle for minorities comparatively. And also for older workers who are seeking a new career, whether they just want to try something different, or maybe they've lost their job and they've decided, well, here I am in middle age, I've lost my job, maybe I can pursue my dream. I'm quoting here from a very important study by the Institute for Justice on occupational licensing as it regards lower income occupations. And the authors say that the licensure hurdles are likely exceptionally burdensome for lower income workers because those entering or re-entering the work world are typically have fewer resources than those who are pursuing higher income occupations. But I would argue that the burdens are not just faced by those with limited means. The burdens of licensure are also imposed on the society itself. Discouraging low-income workers, especially, from new jobs or from the possibilities of pursuing their own independent businesses harms their economic stability, but it also prevents them from being able to employ others. It prevents them from bringing in more income into their communities. Adam Smith is an economist. I like to quote him. It's a failing. He put it this way: the patrimony of a poor man lies in the strength and dexterity of his own hands. So he sees that the primary labor product of someone of limited means is his own ability to work. So hindering him from employing his own strength and dexterity in whatever manner he thinks is proper without injury to his neighbor, and that's where we get to the safety and quality problem, is a plain violation of his most sacred property. And I think that's why it's important in the state of North Carolina that our Constitution respects that in Article 1, Section 1. So, as I see it, allowing low-income workers greater avenues to entrepreneurship is particularly helpful to low-income areas. My study that's in your package on a voluntary certification in the appendix will go into this into greater detail. But entrepreneurship, as I'm sure you know, offers a ladder out of poverty, but it also helps lift poor entrepreneurs' communities along with them. I'm quoting from Federal Reserve Bank economist Kelly Edmonston. He says, entrepreneurship may yield a double dividend in low and moderate income communities. Double dividend meaning in contrast within upper income communities, which already have some of these resources. Many of the retail and service establishments available in higher income areas are not available often in moderate and low income areas. Entrepreneurial activity not only provides income to the entrepreneurs, but also perhaps to others in community, and it also provides the needed goods and services. That barber who may be able to get a job, may be able to go into work for himself. If he's successful, may be able to hire some other people with him. If you go into some service work, you may be able to bring people along with you. So I see it as very important for the overall economic health of the state, especially at the lower levels. Now, as we know, occupational licensing, the reason that we engage into it, first and foremost, is to protect safety and to ensure quality. However, the most consistent finding in research is not that occupational licensing succeeds in ensuring safety and quality of work. What the most consistent finding is that it succeeds in boosting the overall earnings of those who are already in the field and raising costs on consumers. As Morris Clymer, as I mentioned earlier, as he's done the most work in the economic field on occupational licensing. In his survey, he said the most generally held view on the economics of occupational licensing is that it restricts the supply of labor to the occupation and thereby drives up the price of labor, and as well as services rendered. This results in what researchers call an earnings premium, a lifetime earnings premium for those in the field regulated by the state. For some occupations, it can be 15% greater earnings over the lifetime. For some of the more higher earning licensed professions, it can be 20 to 30%. That's over than what they would face with open competition, where their supply of competitors isn't artificially limited by the state. Restricting the supply of labor also restricts the supply of jobs. Quoting from a recent Obama administration white paper on occupational licensing, which is very thorough, and I was very impressed with it, and I commend it. By one estimate, licensing restrictions cost, this is federal, millions of jobs nationwide and raise consumer expenses by over $100 billion. Let's say he's off, let's say this report's off by a factor of 2. That's still pretty doggone significant. Higher earnings to service providers mean higher prices on consumers to obtain the cost of service professionals. That means, as people are price sensitive, as you and I are price sensitive, we do other things, potentially. We might decide to forego necessary work. It's too expensive. I can probably get by with it. People might choose to do it themselves. They may seek out a family member or a friend who can do it. They could find someone who might do it under the table. For example, there may be someone who used to do home repairs, who is a felon and is now trying to get his life in order, but because of it, he's not allowed to be licensed because of his history. So he may work under the table. They might find someone who promises it kind of fly-by-night, just get on Craigslist and get lucky. And they may end up be taken by a scam. For many of these reasons, it's why the research literature is inconsistent and really rather muddy on the issue of whether occupational licensing actually protects safety and produces quality in this overall service. Some of the counterintuitive findings that researchers have found. There are greater electrocution rates in states with stricter electrical licensing laws. Higher rates of blindness in states with greater optometry licensing laws. Greater rates of poor dental hygiene in states with stricter dental licensing laws. Greater risk of rabies where there's more restrictions on veterinarians. And partly for that is because there's a limited supply of labor of people who would be able to detect it. So, and one of the reasons why that is because licensing is sort of an input restriction, and it looks at the process. So we want to, at the state level, change the amount of inputs. We want to make sure that they get the right education inputs, at least it's determined by the board. We want to make sure they jump through the right hoops, get the amount of or follow what the board has determined is the proper procedure, but these things could be changing. On the other hand, consumers and researchers look more at the output. That is the overall level of service received. That would include not just from licensed professionals, but from friends, neighbors, yourself, or taking a chance on fate and seeing if things don't break down. As I think was very important in the Program Evaluation Division report, occupational licensing is not the only way for the state to address safety and quality issues of service work. It is the most restrictive. So I quote from there, from their report. It's the most restrictive form of occupational regulation and it prohibits, and I wanted to highlight that it prohibits people because of our state constitution. It can deny individuals the legal opportunity to work, and the basis for the denial and the prohibition is the significant risk of harm to the public. And you did mention this in your talk. States differ greatly over which occupations should fall under the scrutiny of licensure. To me, that tells me that there is a significant disagreement over what actually rises to the level of significant risk of harm posed to the public. In 2004, the Council of State Governments had a report that listed the number of state-regulated professions nationwide as 1,100, and maybe even more than that by now. There's over 1,100. But fewer than 60 are licensed in all of the states. So that's about 5.5% out of 1,100 professions that are licensed that are considered among all the states to rise to that level of significant risk. In the IJ study, which just looked at 102 lower income occupations, out of those, only 15 were licensed in 40 states or more. So that's in 40 states as opposed to all of them. I didn't have the time to look to see how much the breakdown, if it was still about 5.5%, but still 15% out of those are licensed by a strong number of states and considered to be significant risk of harm posed to the public. Certification is merely the next step down in occupational regulation. Certification addresses the health and safety concerns without the prohibition of someone's entry into a field. So, quoting from the PED report, individuals not certified may still practice in the field, but they may not use the protected title. They may not advertise themselves to the public as certified. So, if you go to your mechanic, this is not, you already know, at least you should, I want to get a certified mechanic, unless you have a buddy who is a shade tree mechanic, and those are the best kinds of buddies. But when the public needs assistance in identifying competent practices, they know to look for a certified professional in areas that are not under state licensure. I'm not going to quote from this and the next, but this chart is taken from my study over this past summer on voluntary certification. I compare and contrast licensing and certification in different ways regarding the hurdles, the economic hurdles, its effect on supply, its effect on consumer choice and earnings, its effect on consumer costs, how they differ in respect to low-income entrepreneurship, which I argued earlier, and on low-income communities, which I think is very important. Does it have more black market effects or less? What does it really mean for safety and quality? All of these things are in my study. I'm not going to quote from them up here. I would say, as far as the count of job categories or occupations licensed among the states, it's very difficult to make comparisons, absolute numerical comparisons among the states, because they differ in how they do it. So if you go to Career One Stop, which is the Department of Labor site that lists them, some states will break down general contracting, for instance, will break it down into individual tasks that a laborer would do. Some will just put it under contracting. Some tasks will be broken into apprentice, master, some of those guild categories. So one of the reports is done by Adam Summers of Reason, where he looked at the issue nationally and applied a standardization to look at how the states compare found North Carolina to be tied for 12th most restrictive in the nation. Goldwater report by Byron Schlomock did it slightly different. That's I will have the figure up there in a minute. He had us tied for 15th most restrictive. The unadjusted count on career one-stop, we're 30th. In the Mercatus study of occupational freedom, we're 39th most free, which means we're basically 11th least free. The Mercatus study not only looks at occupations that are licensed, but it also includes the costs of the licensing and the different costs in time and money. The Institution of Justice, we're 17th most restrictive on low-income occupations. And in the White House report, which is not just state license, but also federal licenses, 22% of North Carolinians have to get a license in order to pursue their field of choice. And that puts us at 22nd in the nation, 22nd highest. Regionally, North Carolina is more restrictive than all of our neighbors but one in terms of overall occupations that are licensed. This is from the Goldwater Institute. The count here is 154. South Carolina has about 1/3 of that at 49. Virginia is at 76, so a little less than a half. Tennessee is much greater than us. As far as low-income occupations, we're about right in the middle of our regional, the southeastern states. North Carolina's got a long history of restrictions on occupational freedom. A study from 1956 that was cited by Milton Friedman found that in 1938, the state was already licensing 60 occupations. I mean, at this point in time, licensing 60 occupations would make us one of the more free states in the nation. We continue to add more boards. From the 1970s, we had 30. We added 7 in the 80s. We added 9 in the 90s. We added 5 in the 2000s and 2 in 2010. And somewhere, I did this count back in 2012, and somewhere I've missed 2. So I'm not sure which day, and I didn't have time to try to figure out which 2 I was missing. So I apologize for that, being off by 2. We've gone over the PED report. These were the boards. There were 12 boards that they pulled out for needing additional scrutiny. The IJ study found 6 out of 48 lower income jobs licensed in North Carolina are licensed in fewer than half of other states. That included landscape contractor, only 10 states did, opticians, only 22 states, sign language interpreter, only 16, crane operators, only 18, locksmith, 13 states, and then weigher, 24 states. My recommendations, and these are again based on wanting to uphold what we see in this state legally is a self-evident right to people to enjoy the fruits of our own labor. 1, let's promote voluntary certification over occupational licensing wherever possible. I mean, I understand politics are involved and that there will be reasons and there will be needs to prove the possibility. I understand that. But I think we should start off with the fact that significant harm, the significant risk of harm to the public is a very high standard, and it should be reserved for actual really significant risks. So to promote voluntary certification, let's also make sure that state law adequately punishes fraudulent claims of certification. Let's encourage certification and promote public awareness of it so that people know to look for it. And then finally, state officials should trust that consumers and service providers know their needs and can choose accordingly. It could be, for example, that someone's just starting out a career, wants to find out if this is what I want to do. And so he wants to step into it as opposed to jump full bore into all the education requirements and meeting all the hoops to satisfy the certification requirements that he's looking for, the different certification boards. It could be that you as a consumer have a small need, or that you want to help someone get on their feet. And so you're willing to compromise your risk of safety a little bit in order to serve a different need. So I think overall, the state should also trust its consumers and its service providers. We should definitely allow more occupational freedom in North Carolina. So that will include eliminating questionable boards and licenses. I think what we've identified in the Program Evaluation Division is a good start. I think that anywhere where licenses are, such as identified in the IJ report, where fewer than half the states or fewer than a set number of states find it significant to license, then I think those should definitely come under scrutiny. I think politically it would be very important to set a numeric goal and an effective date so that, and I put up two examples to say, by 2021, let's make sure in North Carolina we've cut down to the same number of licensed occupations as South Carolina. Or by 2020, let's get rid of a third of job occupations that we're licensing, and we've moved them into certification. That can be done, I think, and it should be done by working within the boards, making sure that they're on the same page and they have the same goal, that they can help identify some areas that they don't possibly need to be involved in anymore. And I think also that in 2013, the legislature passed the Regulatory Reform Act of 2013 that brought in sunset provisions with periodic review. I think we need to apply that principle to occupational boards as well. That's in your report, and I agree with that finding. I think it's very important. We need to look at sunsetting boards and having periodic review of them. On the other side of it, on the flip side, before new boards get started, let's apply strong sunrise provisions. At this point in time, there's not going to be many brand new occupations cropping up where significant risk of public harm are such that we're going to have to rush to regulate them immediately. If there's a significant risk to public harm, we probably would have identified it by now. So understanding that licensure also limits supply and is lucrative to people in a regulated industry, we need to be very suspicious of new fields that come to the legislature and say, hey, we need you guys to regulate us. So these kind of sunrise provisions could include actionable evidence that the occupation without state regulation under what is now would be voluntary certification and other ways of, and other alternatives such as Angie's List, word of mouth, Yelp reviews and things like that, present a clear threat to public health. Would need objective, thorough cost-benefit analyses, not brought within the organization, but done by a third party. And a consideration, again, of how many other states find this occupation worth licensing. If other states don't think it's that important, then we probably don't need to either. And finally, we should make getting a license less burdensome. For the licenses that we continue to keep, see if we can cut the amount of fees that we're charging or the amount of work time. I mean, do barbers need to spend, what is it, 7,700? Yeah, do they need, excuse me, 700. Yeah, 7,000 would be ridiculous, 20 years. 700 and some hours in the field. Do some of these others need that much? And cut examination requirements when possible. So these four things I think would definitely help put North Carolina on the right path to upholding Article 1, Section 1 of our own Constitution. Voluntary certification, more occupational freedom, strong sunrise provisions, and lesser burdens for licensure. That will conclude my remarks. So I'll take more questions.
Thank you, John. Questions from the committee? Yes, Representative Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Sanders. Appreciate your presentation. I've got a couple of comments and a couple of questions. The first comment I have is when y'all mentioned sign language interpreter, and I see on this document here the $923 fee.
That's the yellow document. That's from the Institute of Justice.
Okay. I was just discussing with my fellow attorney down there, state bar dues are $350, I think. So I don't know why they're 3 times as much as an attorney, but that's very interesting. We may need to take a look at that. Then I have a couple of questions on, they're not numbered, but you talked about the number of licensed job categories.
Yes.
That chart. Could you please discuss a little bit of the difference between 154 job categories versus we have 55 occupational licensing boards? What is the relationship between those two?
A board will license more than a single occupation or a single category. And sometimes it provides licenses for tasks, which is why I was mentioning earlier it's very difficult to make comparisons across states, because some states will do a general license and some states will break it into different avenue tasks within a line of work.
Thank you. That makes sense. The last thing I want to mention, you just about touched on at the end with Angie's List and Yelp. Could you discuss a little more the rise of consumer ratings mechanisms like eBay and Uber, the effect of this on the whole issue of occupational licensing?
Yes, there are an expanding, especially with the internet and with phone apps, an expanding way for consumers to protect themselves against mal providers. For example, when I took the family to New Orleans a couple of years ago, I wanted to take the kids on a haunted tour. But I wanted to make sure, because there were tons of tours of New Orleans that were available. And what I hadn't checked was if they're licensed. I know in some cities, and I think Wilmington is one, they even have licensing of touring agencies. But that aside, I went to reviews. And I looked at the reviews of these different touring sites until I found one that had very high reviews. This did not take me but 10, 15 minutes at the most of poking around. And if you go to Yelp, you can find on different services, you can find consumer complaints, we really like this place, I was very impressed. Facebook. If you have a bad dealing with something, people will put it on Facebook. Don't go to this. So the word of mouth thing is kind of amplified with what's available online. But then again, there are, we already know about things like good housekeeping, and it's very important for companies to earn the good housekeeping seal of approval. Angie's List is another that's very good for giving people reviews, consumer reports, especially if you're looking at a car or some electronics, underwriter's laboratory, that sort of thing. I'm probably missing something.
That's great. Thank you. Follow up, Mr. Chairman. And I apologize for not asking about follow-ups a few minutes ago.
That's okay.
I don't know if you know anything about this or not, but when I was in business school, in services marketing, there was a lot of research on word of mouth. Do you know if there's been further formal research in the last 20 years or so on word of mouth? Because it was very important then. I'm sure it's even more important now.
Personally, no, I've not looked into, as far as, the research literature on word of mouth, but I'm certain that there's tons of it.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I'm going to ask Chuck Heffron with PED to weigh in on the number of licensees versus number of agencies.
In response to Representative Jordan's question, our review as directed was limited to occupations regulated by occupational licensing agencies. We identified 3 governance models in North Carolina that regulate licensed occupations, and this is one governance model where essentially the OLA performs all the administrative and regulatory functions. Another governance model is where there is a board that has regulatory authority, but the board is administratively housed within a traditional state agency, and we identified 6 occupations that use that organizational model. as identified on page 5 in our report. And then the third governance model that exists in North Carolina is where the traditional state agency head has regulatory authority and all the administrative functions are performed by the state agency. So I just wanted to note that there's lots of other occupations that are regulated in North Carolina, licensed occupations regulated in North Carolina that do not fall under the jurisdictional authority of OLAs.
Thank you for that. It would be helpful if we could have a list, I think to the public, who probably don't know what an OLA is. It would be helpful to speak in terms of number of professions that are licensed. So if we could take your 55 and expand it out to include the total number of professions, I think that would be helpful, and maybe a little coordination. We could see how we mesh the 55 number with the 150 plus number that we're looking at today. Thank you. Any other questions? Representative Hardister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is just more of a comment for the committee. John, I appreciate the presentation today. I think it's very helpful, and the document you passed out from the Institute of Justice, is
Yes.
that where this is from? Yeah, I mean, you look at this, there's really no rhyme or reason here. You look at the different occupations, and it was mentioned earlier, sign language, $923, school bus driver, $150, a fire alarm installer, $165, athletic trainer, $400. Just, I think there needs to be more oversight here, and I'm glad that we're looking at this, and I just wanted to say that on the record. I hope we can incorporate some of the recommendations that were brought forth by PED and Mr. Chairman. I'm glad that we're having this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? All right. Thank you. Thank you for being here, John and Becky. Next up on presentations, Bill Rowe with the North Carolina Justice Center. Disclosure, I have never been on their board.
We might have some openings, I'm not sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I'm Bill Rowe with the North Carolina Justice Center. We are an advocacy group on behalf of low-income individuals and communities. And I know the agenda says I'm here for a presentation, but it's more just some brief remarks, to be honest with you. We commend the committee and the chairman for bringing this forward. We think it's a really good idea to review your occupational licensing boards, particularly looking at costs, which has come up during the discussion here today, but also some of the requirements that are needed to obtain licenses, particularly for people who with low means. Trying to get into these businesses may be difficult. I think it's probably a very good idea to do a review where we make sure that the fit with skills needed with the job, that for what we're licensing people for, that we really are requiring the right skills for what we're licensing them with. Obviously, issues can come up. You've seen some of the reports, prices of goods and services, and also a restriction on employment opportunities if your occupational licensing procedures go too far. Obviously, those concerns have to be weighed against the goals of promoting consumer health and safety, particularly for consumers having some access to complain and to be able to be heard when they have been wronged by someone. And I think one of the recommendations has been to have a more open process for that, and one that people can know what they have to do and that records are more formally kept. We think professional objectives is a good part of occupational licensing. Obviously, having clear guidelines for professional development and training will improve that work, and so we think that's another piece that has to be measured against whether occupational licensing is being a hindrance to employment opportunities and raising prices and for goods and services. So I think a more thoughtful approach is good, and we really appreciate what this committee is doing. we want to also, I know criminal records has come up, and this has been an issue that we have worked on in the past. And the committee, the bigger committee, dealt with this a couple years ago, where it was understood that a lot of occupational licensing boards did not have standards around criminal records. It may have just had a crime of moral turpitude or something very general. Some had regulations, some had no guidance at all. And so if you did have a record, you really didn't understand when you were applying for a job what was the standard you had to meet to be able to be considered for it. This legislature and this committee led the way. I think Senator Hartzell put the bill in to establish some standards to be looked at in order to determine if someone is eligible because of a criminal record. And that was a wonderful advancement, because then people understand what they need to show in order to be licensed if they have a criminal record. So we applaud you for that. One other piece I will mention, and there was a lot of debate last session around misclassification, meaning misclassifying employees as independent contractors. There were several bills that were introduced. Some got very close to becoming law. There was general consensus in those pieces of legislation that some licensing organizations or occupational licensing organizations should have more authority to police this fraudulent business practice. There is an executive order in place by Governor McCrory, but that's a piece that's still out there that may need some attention to make sure. I know Senator Tucker, it was a big issue for him for understanding how you can police yourselves when this kind of practice is going on. The Justice Center looks forward to working with the subcommittee as it does its work. We would hope to be back at another time in the future with some recommendations, and look forward to working with you all. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions from the committee? Thank you.